Gottfried Leibniz. Little background for him. He was born in what is now Germany. But of course, then it was not Germany. Germany was later created, then divided, then reunified. Now, prior to the 18th century, from the standpoint of philosophy, German culture remained fairly stagnant. The common people spoke German, the upper classes spoke French, and scholars wrote in Latin. Now, what is now Germany consisted of various Germanic states. And if you are familiar with the history of the Reformation and the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, the German states were, very disrupted. And so during this time period, it's not incredibly surprising that, aside from Leibniz, the German states did not produce any significant philosophical thinkers, or so the people who decide who's significant believe. Now, what about background for Leibniz himself? Well, he was born in 1646 in what is now, or what was then Leipzig, but is now Leipzig, Germany. He learned to read Greek and Latin and bragged that at age 13 he was able to read the scholastic text as easily as other people read romantic novels. And the scholastic texts are not like scholastic, like in terms of just being from school. The scholastics were a academic, philosophical group, and we get our term scholars from them. Just like in many ways, we get our term academics from Plato's Academy. And many terms today arise from philosophy, scholastics, academy, etc. He entered the University of Leipzig at 15, graduated at 17, studied mathematics, and then returned to Leipzig to study law. But he was blocked in his attempt to get his doctorate. But then he received his doctorate at the age of 21 from the University of Altdorf near Nuremberg. He was offered the chance to become a professor, but decided on an alternative career, namely that of as a diplomat and administrator. So during his professional career, he traveled Europe as a diplomat, and according to the stories, he met many of the great thinkers of that time. One included Nicolas Malebranche, a French follower of René Descartes, who built on Descartes' notion. When I was in grad school, one of the professors claimed that Malebranche really bought into Descartes' philosophy that animals lacked minds, and supposedly he would go through the city kicking cats to hear the noises they would make. And according to one story, one day he was found murdered, possibly by cats. No, probably not true, but makes for a good story. He also met Robert Boyle, the famous English chemist, Henry Oldenburg, who was a secretary of the Royal Society, and our good dead friend Spinoza, who developed a form of pantheism, which Leibniz regarded as crazy. Now, in addition to his diplomacy and philosophy, he's also famous for building a calculating machine. Mechanical, of course, this was pre-electricity. It would add, subtract, extract roots, multiply, and divide. And because of this impressive accomplishment, he became a member in the famous Royal Society. Now, he's here, of course, because he's a philosopher. But most of his philosophical work was not a systematic project like we would see in someone like Aristotle or Plato. It was done sort of on the side, in letters, essays, pamphlets, unpublished works. And so he's sort of, I don't want to say an accidental philosopher, but sort of a, philosophy was kind of a side deal for him. Now, what about his diplomatic goals? Well, one of his main goals was his hope, his desire to reunite the Catholic and Protestant churches that had been divided by the Reformation. He believed that because the two would have theological propositions that would be acceptable to both, they would be, able to reunify them. Now, in terms of did this succeed, in his own time, obviously not. And of course, today, we have across the world, many branches of the Protestant, what we consider Protestantism. Even in my adopted state of Florida, if you travel about, you'll see Catholic churches, but you also see many different types of what would be considered Protestant churches. Now, on the positive side, looking back at the religious wars between Christians in Europe, we haven't had one of those in a really long time. So that we could say mission accomplished. Now, we also hope to unify the states of Europe, seeing all the war and so forth. And during his own time, of course, that did not succeed because we got later wars, most importantly World War I, World War II, and Europe now, of course, is somewhat unified, although because of Brexit splitting up. And of course, depending on how you feel about Russia, Europe, not Europe, we could say that Russia is kind of unified, but kind of not. Now, outside of diplomacy, he had a fight with Sir Isaac Newton, the gravity guy, over who developed the infinitesimal calculus. And the winner of this, according to some, was Leibniz, because he's also a math guy. So, pretty impressive guy. Despite being pretty impressive, he died in 1716, and according to some stories, only his secretary attended his funeral, which, if true, would be a kind of a sad ending for such a accomplished person. Now, despite the fact that he did much of his work, kind of in philosophy, kind of on the side, he did create a substantial body of work, including new essays concerning human understanding, in which he essentially does battle with John Locke, and John Locke also is very concerned with criticizing Leibniz. They have very differing views. He wrote the Odyssey, which is the Odyssey is a theological term for the reply to the problem of evil, which we'll see more of soon, and probably is one of his strangest titled works, but well known in metaphysics, is the Monadology. And for him, reality is made of monads, for real, not making this up. And if you take the class in metaphysics, you'll get to learn probably more than you wish to learn about the monads. Now, his approach to philosophy is one that is kind of a hallmark of the time period Leibniz was Leibnizing. It was also adopted by thinkers, fellow rationalists like our good friend Descartes, and also folks like Thomas Hobbes liked it as well, although he was an empiricist. The idea was this: logic and mathematical methods, which are deductive, provide the method you need to find truth. And Leibniz had great faith in the power of logic. One reason for this was because one of his great discoveries was that you could take complex mathematical concepts and reduce them down to combinations of simpler concepts. You could build complicated wholes out of simple parts. And he developed, and this is probably from the standpoint of anyone who uses any computers, looks at the Facebook, the Instagrams, all this stuff, PlayStation, Xbox, etc., was his development of binary mathematics, in which you can express all numbers as combinations of zeros and ones. So incredibly important, because without Leibniz, we wouldn't have the information age we have today. Now, of course, you could say that someone else would have done it, but that's true of anything. So Leibniz certainly deserves credit for developing it, in the same sense that anybody who develops fundamental critical things deserves credit. Now, he wasn't content to stop at math. He contended that this method could be extended far beyond mathematics to all areas of knowledge. Now, this would make sense in the case of physics because, in physics, crudely put, they're trying to find out what are the basic things that make up everything. But he also believed it could apply in metaphysics. Also, this may seem strange, even stranger, law and even ethics, that you could apply this method. And he had great hopes in that it would work out. Now, in some degree, his dream did kind of come true, because what he basically advocated was modeling, reality using mathematics. And when you look at our computer models today, everything from, say, weather models to simulations, engineering simulations in computers, they're kind of fulfilling the dream of Leibniz, that we're building these mathematical models, reducing things down to the simples, and being able to understand things in these languages. So, pretty important dead guy. Now, our concern here is, of course, with his view of God. And so we'll take a look at some of his arguments for God's existence, and then move on to one of his big areas in philosophy, the problem of evil. So what about God? Well, Leibniz, like many philosophers, kind of took some of the older arguments, cleaned them up, repainted them, and then resold them. He has a ontological argument that is, essentially similar to St. Anselm's ontological argument. Also Descartes, because Descartes also took St. Anselm's argument, retold it, repainted it, resold it, and Leibniz said, "Hey, I'll do that too. Looks good." He also borrowed from St. Augustine, which is an argument from eternal and necessary truths, but an upgrade, repainted, etc. He also developed a design argument with his unique spin on it, that's based on his concept of pre-established harmony. Also, a cosmological argument based on his principle of sufficient reason. And you might recall that the ontological argument, crudely put, is God must exist because he is perfect. Because if he didn't exist, he wouldn't be perfect, but he is, so he does. The design argument is there's a design to the universe, no design without a designer. The only designer up to the task is God, so God exists. Cosmological arguments essentially are creation arguments. There is something, there couldn't be something without a creator because you can't get something from nothing, so there must be a creator. This creator is God. So let's take a look at some of his arguments. Now, one of his arguments is the proof of God's existence by possibility and necessity, which perhaps he was inspired in part by our good dead friend, St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, he begins by defining God, and God is, for him, the supreme substance. Hence, if you're wondering, why are nachos there? Well, those are nachos supreme. And so, presumably, if God is a supreme substance, he is a substance with sour cream. I guess that's what makes it supreme. Maybe guacamole or something, too. So, briefly, what's a substance? Well, in philosophy, there's many, not surprisingly, there's many definitions of it. But kind of the classic one is this. A substance, philosophically speaking, is something that can exist on its own, independent of other things. So let's take the example of the nachos there. If you take one of the chips, you could have a chip all by itself. You could pull it out of the pile of nachos and set it on the table, and you could, in the analogy, you could think of that as a substance. You could have a chip on its own. You can encounter the lone chip. But what you couldn't do is somehow pull out, say, the color of the chip and have a handful of yellow. You could have yellow particles, but not just yellow. And you couldn't somehow grab the chip and pull out the shape and have just triangle on itself. So we never just run into things like triangularity or yellow. We run into yellow triangle things like nacho chips. And so something that can exist on its own would be roughly and kind of inaccurately put, like the nacho chip, a thing that can exist on its own. And the qualities of the thing can't exist on their own. So for God to be the supreme substance would mean God is an entity that exists on his own, but he's the supreme one. Again, doesn't mean he comes with sour cream. It means of all the substances, he's top substance. Now, of course, he's got all kinds of other amazing features as well. He's unique, universal, and necessary. Nothing is independent of him. And he's a being of pure consequence, a possible being. Which means, according to Leibniz at least, he is incapable of limits, and he must contain as much reality as possible. In other words, going back to our good dead friend, St. Thomas Aquinas, God is unlimited. So if you think of a limit, God's beyond that. And he's beyond that one too. Oh, and also that one. And he contains as much reality as possible. He's the realest of the real. And again, we normally tend to think today in terms of like things being real or not real. It's like it's binary, real or not real. But there's degrees of reality for thinkers like Leibniz and many philosophers. And my usual analogy is, again, think of levels in a video game or a role-playing game where you start off, weak first level, and then you build up, power. And you can think of those as like power levels. So how, real is God? Well, as we saw with St. Anselm, and most thinkers who talk about God, regard God as perfect. Not only perfect, but absolutely perfect. Why? Well, God has no limits. So his perfection is not just perfection, it's absolutely infinite perfection. Now, the term perfection is kind of, I don't want to say misused, but kind of used broadly. So there's perfection itself, which is being perfect. And there also, which is kind of unfortunate use of the term because it can be confusing, there's also the term perfections in terms of qualities creatures have. So lesser creatures like me and squirrels and dolphins and all humans, our perfections are from God. Now, our perfections are our positive qualities, our good features. So these would be things, like our nobility, our kindness, our generosity, our intelligence, our reason. And our imperfections would be negative qualities, like our greed, our lack of empathy, our selfishness. For Leibniz, we get all our good qualities, our perfections, our positive qualities from God. Our imperfections, and more on this later, come from ourselves, from our limited nature. And we're limited by necessity. Again, going back to when we talked about necessity and possibility, Leibniz's view is that by necessity, logically, we must be limited. And we'll see why in the future. So this is what distinguishes us from God. God is absolutely infinitely perfect, and we are not. We have imperfections. We get all our good stuff from God. All our bad stuff arises from by necessity, from our limited nature. So how does this prove that God exists? Well, this is what he contends. He claims that God is the source of existences and essences, as far as they are real, or what is real in the possible. So everything that exists comes from God. Everything that is real comes from God, and the essences of things, the qualities that make a thing what it is, and if it didn't have them, it wouldn't be that thing, all from God. And he claims that without God, there'd be nothing existing and nothing possible. So this is very, cosmological. So, if there is a reality in essences, possibilities, or eternal truths, he claims it must be found in the existence of a necessary being. Now here he's getting kind of like Aquinas, because remember Aquinas said the possibility necessity argument, but he moves a bit beyond Aquinas here, because he's willing to say that this being, necessary being, its essence must involve existence. In other words, its essential properties include the property of existence. So in order to be what it is, it's got to exist. If it didn't exist, it wouldn't be what it is. So we can see where this is going. It's got to exist. So its essence involves existence, or alternatively, it is sufficient to be possible in order to be actual, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but it's in a way kind of a superpower. Here's the idea. Suppose you had something, like God supposedly, that it's sufficient to be possible in order to be actual. What does that mean? Well, to kind of break that down, philosophically, for something to be sufficient means kind of like what we think of in everyday life. Something sufficient, if you have sufficient money to get something, then you can get it. It's enough to get it. Likewise, philosophically speaking, if one thing is sufficient for another, if you have the first thing, then you can get the second thing. You don't have to, but you can. So what he's saying here essentially is that in the case of God, if God is possible, then he is actual, based on, I guess, the nature of God. So if he could exist, then he will exist. Now, much like our good dead friend St. Anselm, this capability that if he can exist, he must exist, or will exist, is limited only to God. He says God alone must exist if he is possible. So why? Why would him being possible mean that he does exist? Well, Leibniz says that nothing can hinder the possibility of what is without limits, without negation, without contradiction. And he claims this is sufficient to establish the existence of God a priori, by pure reason prior to experience. So kind of what he's saying here is that in God's case, if he could exist, he does exist. Why? Well, crudely put, nothing can stop God from existing. Nothing could prevent it. So he must, therefore, exist. And so this establishes, at least according to Leibniz, that God exists. So that's his first argument for God's existence. Next, we'll take a look at his cosmological argument.